A framework for national nutrition was presented as modernization. It entered policy and then daily life through official guidelines. The effects of this shift took decades to become visible. This was one change in a series of similar institutional decisions. In the early 1950s, a new framework began to take shape within American public health institutions. It wasn't introduced as an experiment. It was framed as modernization, as scientific progress, as the responsible application of emerging nutritional knowledge to protect an entire population. The language used was careful, authoritative, and designed to reassure. What it didn't mention was how much remained unknown, how many assumptions were being codified into permanent recommendations, and how little room would be left for reversal once the system was built. The shift began with fat, dietary fat specifically. A small group of researchers had observed correlations between fat consumption and heart disease rates in selected populations. These observations were preliminary, incomplete, and hotly contested within the scientific community itself. But they arrived at a moment when public health officials were searching for simple, actionable messages that could be delivered at scale. Complexity didn't translate well to pamphlets, school programs, or national campaigns. Nuance was a barrier to implementation. So the correlations were simplified, the uncertainties were quietly set aside, and the recommendations were released as though they represented settled science. What followed wasn't a public debate. It was a gradual institutionalization. The recommendations moved from advisory committees to government agencies, from agencies to schools, from schools to hospitals, from hospitals to food manufacturers. At each stage, the original uncertainties faded further into the background. By the time these guidelines reached the average household, they were presented not as one interpretation among many, but as objective fact, backed by the full weight of institutional authority. Most people didn't question it. Why would they? The guidance came from the same institutions that had eradicated polio, that had established sanitation standards, that had built the modern medical system. Trust was still intact. Skepticism felt like ignorance. To ask whether the recommendations were premature, whether the evidence was sufficient, whether alternative explanations had been adequately considered, these questions didn't occur to most people because the system itself had already answered them. The answer was always, this is what the science says. But this wasn't what the science said. It was what a particular interpretation of incomplete data, filtered through institutional incentives and political pressures, had produced. The scientists who disagreed, who pointed to contradictory evidence, who urged caution, were marginalized, not through conspiracy, but through the ordinary mechanisms of professional consensus. Funding followed the dominant hypothesis. Journals favored confirmatory studies. Conferences elevated the voices that aligned with policy. Dissent wasn't silenced, it was simply crowded out. This wasn't discussed openly. The internal debates, the rejected studies, the alternative frameworks that never received funding, none of this reached the public. What reached the public were food pyramids, nutrition labels, and school cafeteria menus designed around the assumption that fat was the enemy and carbohydrates were safe. The infrastructure was built to reinforce the message. To live outside it required active resistance, access to alternative information, and a willingness to be seen as eccentric or irresponsible. It seemed too small to matter back then. A shift in dietary guidelines, a change in the way foods were labeled and marketed, a new set of recommendations that felt reasonable, moderate, and grounded in the stated authority of science. How much harm could come from eating less fat and more grains? The answer wouldn't become visible for decades, because the harm wasn't immediate. It was cumulative. It was metabolic. It was written into the bodies of children who grew up inside this system, who never knew that what they were being fed was the result of an unfinished experiment implemented at national scale with no exit plan. The real impact appeared years later, not in the 1960s when the guidelines were first codified, but in the 1980s and 1990s when obesity rates began to climb sharply across every demographic. When type 2 diabetes, once rare in children, began appearing in pediatric wards. When metabolic syndrome became common enough to require a name. These patterns didn't emerge randomly. They emerged in populations that had followed the guidelines most closely, that had replaced butter with margarine, that had reduced fat and increased refined carbohydrates, that had done exactly what they were told. By the time consequences were visible, habits were already set. An entire generation had grown up eating this way. The food industry had reformulated thousands of products around the low-fat model, replacing fats with sugars and industrial starches to maintain palatability. School lunch programs had institutionalized the guidelines. Medical training had incorporated them. Insurance policies and workplace wellness programs reinforced them. To reverse course would have required admitting that the system had been wrong, not just in a minor way, but fundamentally, for decades. And institutions don't admit that easily. Instead, the response was to double down. When obesity rates rose, the explanation offered wasn't that the guidelines might be flawed, it was that people weren't following them strictly enough. The problem was framed as individual failure, a lack of willpower, a lack of exercise, a lack of discipline. The solution was more of the same. Eat less fat, eat more whole grains, count your calories, try harder. The structural question, whether the dietary framework itself might be causing harm, was rarely raised in mainstream discourse. To raise it was to challenge not just a set of recommendations, but the credibility of the entire public health apparatus. This wasn't an accident. The system had been built to resist exactly this kind of revision. Guidelines, once established, develop their own gravity. They shape research priorities, determining which questions get funding and which don't. They shape medical education, determining what doctors learn to recommend. They shape industry, determining which products are developed and marketed. They shape culture, determining what counts as responsible eating. Changing any one piece requires changing all of them simultaneously. And the institutions that would need to lead that change are the same ones whose authority depends on the current framework being correct. So the experiment continued, not because new evidence supported it, but because stopping it would require admitting it should never have started. The guidelines remained largely unchanged for decades, even as contradictory research accumulated. Studies showing that saturated fat wasn't the villain it had been made out to be. Studies showing that refined carbohydrates and sugars drove metabolic dysfunction more powerfully than dietary fat ever did. Studies showing that populations eating traditional high-fat diets had lower rates of the diseases the guidelines were supposed to prevent. This research existed. It was published in peer-reviewed journals. It was discussed at conferences. But it didn't change policy. Because policy wasn't being driven by evidence anymore. It was being driven by institutional inertia. The people who made the original decisions weren't malicious. They believed they were acting in the public interest, making the best choices they could with the information available. But they also made those choices under pressure to act decisively, to provide clear guidance, to be seen as doing something in response to rising heart disease rates. Uncertainty wasn't politically viable. Caution wasn't institutionally rewarded. And so they moved forward with confidence that exceeded their evidence, and built a system that couldn't easily self-correct. What happened next was structural, not individual. The food industry responded rationally to the incentives it was given. If the government said fat was bad, the industry would make low-fat products. If low-fat products tasted worse without added sugar, the industry would add sugar. If adding sugar made products more profitable and more popular, the industry would scale that up. None of this required conspiracy. It required only the ordinary logic of market response to regulatory signals. The system designed for scale not people. It optimized for consistency, compliance, and simplicity. What it didn't optimize for was metabolic health. The consequences were written into entire populations. Children who never knew what their bodies might have been like on a different diet, adults who developed chronic conditions while following expert advice, communities where diabetes and obesity became normalized because everyone was eating the same way, the way they'd been taught was correct. The suffering was real, but it was also diffuse, statistical, easy to attribute to other causes. And because it unfolded over decades, there was no clear before and after that would force a reckoning. This is what makes the story so difficult to tell clearly. There's no single villain, no moment of obvious betrayal, no dramatic revelation that changes everything. There's only a long accumulation of institutional decisions, each one defensible in isolation, each one contributing to a system that produced outcomes nobody intended, but few were willing to acknowledge. The harm was systemic. The responsibility was distributed. The mechanisms that could have corrected course were the same mechanisms that had locked the course in place. And this wasn't the only change. The same institutional patterns, the same incentives toward premature certainty, the resistance to revision appeared across multiple domains of public health and nutrition policy. The treatment of salt, the demonization of cholesterol, the promotion of vegetable oils as universally healthy, the assumption that all calories are metabolically equivalent. Each of these positions was adopted with less evidence than the public was led to believe, institutionalized before the science was settled, and defended long after contradictory data emerged. Similar decisions followed, not because the institutions learned nothing, but because the same structural pressures remained: the demand for clear guidelines, the political cost of uncertainty, the professional incentives that reward confidence and punish revision, the tendency of established consensus to defend itself against challenge, not through evidence, but through authority. These patterns didn't stop with dietary fat. They continued, and they continue still, wherever institutional credibility becomes more important than institutional accuracy.